they're saying that frustrated that they cannot do more. Now, in terms of what Amnesty has been saying, and I think this is not just true with Amnesty, but other leading human rights organizations, as all parties to the conflict should cease their attacks on civilians, and that the U.S. should condemn Israel for its disproportionate response. We sent out a letter to Secretary Rice on January 3rd saying that the U.S. response was lackadaisical and lopsided. You know, the U.S. very quickly, and the whole infrastructure of the U.S. from Berman to Pelosi to the Bush administration, you know, basically blamed Hamas for everything that had happened. We said that this was lopsided, that Israel should also be blamed for its disproportionate response. So we still have an action on our website to Secretary Rice, which you can write to her. It's a little outdated because it's from the 3rd of January, but still the point is the same, that the U.S. response needs to be more even-handed, and it should condemn Israel for deliberately attacking civilians. Humanitarian access should be allowed, and that journalists and human rights monitors should enter. Now, notice there I put humanitarian access should be allowed. Someone can say, well, it is being allowed. But I think that, you know, I would say that in quotes. It's currently being allowed, but the amount that's being permitted to enter and the manner is a paltry sum. And again, I think Samer did a really good job in his talk of talking about that. There's so much more aid that simply needs to enter at this time. We've also said that Egypt should open up its borders to allow for more wounded to enter. I don't exactly know, maybe somebody wants to jump in with a figure, but the number that Egypt has allowed in has been, it's really been a tiny amount of the over 4,500 that are wounded. I've heard figures that are below 100. I don't know. It's hard to. I don't want to say. Again, our numbers are based on sources from others because we don't have people in there at the time. So we've said that Egypt should allow people in, and that the U.S. should investigate if U.S. weapons were used in Israeli attacks on civilians. We've actually now called for an arms embargo, that the U.S. should not send any weapons right now to Israel as well. And that's something that, you know, it's a very strong statement for Amnesty, but we've said that the U.S. should not send its weapons, and that those weapons that were used in the conflict and are continuing to be used, that they should be investigated. It's a violation of U.S. law for U.S. weapons to be used knowingly to harm civilians, and there should be investigations. I'm not optimistic that there will be, just like we saw with the cluster munitions. There was an investigation after the cluster munitions were used against Lebanon. We went to the State Department and others and demanded, and the Pentagon demanded investigation. There was an investigation. It was not made public. So if there is going to be investigation, it should be made public, and there should be accountability. I'm hoping that happens, but I'm not terribly optimistic. In terms of what we've done, the IS is their international secretariat. We've put out 8 statements, which are on our website. We have a letter to Secretary Rice, which you can take. We have a letter to there's also a petition. My intern has a petition if you want to sign the petition. We have a letter to the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Khalilzad. And one of the things that we've condemned was, you know, there were people who were cheering last week's UN binding resolution. I suppose on some level it was good. It's obviously not being followed. But what we were saying was that it doesn't go far enough. The biggest issue that the resolution failed was there was no issue about accountability. And to me, the whole issue, if we're going to move forward and we're going to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again, there has to be an end to impunity and an end to accountability. There has to be accountability. Those who have engaged in war crimes should be held accountable. There was nothing in there about accountability. There was nothing in there even about violations of international humanitarian law, the laws that govern war. There was nothing about human rights. It was basically cease attacks on civilians, you know, allow for humanitarian aid. And those are issues that we're concerned about. But to me, the really issue is that in a matter of 8-9 days, Israel bombed 2 UN facilities. So they bombed one, and then just a few days later, even after there's international outcry about it and there's a binding resolution, they bomb another. And they'll continue to bomb unless there's language in these resolutions that demand for accountability. And specifically, we should not shy about using the term war crime. These are important terms that we have to use. These are war crimes. We should call them war crimes. We have to use terms like collective punishment. They're technical terms. We have to study them. We have to learn how to use them. But war crimes, collective punishment, crimes against humanity, they have very specific definitions, and there's abundant evidence that in the current crisis, we've witnessed all of them. The collective punishment, i.e. humanitarian aid being blocked. the war crimes, deliberate attacks on civilians. These are and crimes against humanity, which we saw the quote from Richard Falk. We also have, we're asking our activists and others interested to organize petitions, teach-ins, show the movie Gaza Strip by James Longley, which is a little dated, but I still think it's very powerful, because we really think that there should be a big educational component. So we have Amnesty members across the country, and some of them have already organized vigils and demonstrations, things like that, but we're putting something together on our website. Should be up by tomorrow, maybe early next week at the latest. We also have a researcher right now in Israel who's pending entry. We did an online chat with her, and that's uploaded. So for example, if you have questions like, and we did the chat partly because we wanted to, some of the questions that we get that are kind of the trickier questions, which is something like, what is their proportionate response? Or, why does Amnesty always condemn Israel but not Hamas? If Hamas wants to its stated goal is to destroy Israel, how can Hamas, listen to these demands, etc.? So a lot of the more critical questions, and also on the opposite side, we get questions like, why doesn't Amnesty talk about the occupation? So it's a good way to have some of these discussions. I think, it's also a good way for us to remain transparent as well and be accountable. And then we just have blog entries as well too. What can be done? A few things. First, and the more that I do work on the Middle East, and particularly Israel-Palestine, I think there has to be an end to the culture of impunity granted to Israel, both in the U.S. government and in society. I think that, and I know, Will and I kind of have the same experience like this. There's this idea that people start talking about how, if you criticize Israel, there are consequences, there are blacklists, there's things like that. And, okay, there obviously are. We know about the Paul Finleys out there and the other stories, etc. But I think that we should nonetheless be very forthcoming in articulating our criticisms of the Israeli government. I think, and that should approach every aspect of society. I think that should be in media, in popular culture, that should be in government. But too often times I hear justifications, even by people who are very critical of Israel, saying, well, it's not really going to get us much. The Washington Post is not going to publish it. I mean, the fact that we have George Basharat's article in the Wall Street Journal saying Israel was guilty of war crimes, Jimmy Carter's article, Rashid Khalidi's article, these are positive signs. Still much more needs to be done, but I think there's still this fear that criticizing Israel doesn't get us much, or I'm going to lose my Obama application, won't go through. I think it's unfortunate that this excuse has led to almost like a self-censorship. And I think that has to end. As an interesting thing about that, and I know I'm on record on the camera, but I'll say this, but, as a human rights organization, unfortunately, sometimes we ourselves are, we ourselves are sometimes not as strong as we should be, to put it mildly. And when this conflict happened, we wrote a very strong letter to Secretary Rice, and unusually strong for Amnesty, where we said the U.S. should cease arms transfers to Israel, which is something we generally do not say. We also said the U.S. should, condemn the U.S. for its lackadaisical response. In response to that email that we sent out, we thought, oh my God, donors will get upset. People, they'll stop, joining Amnesty. They'll cancel their memberships. We actually got the most amount of donations from that one email in all of 2008. We got 19,000 in donations just from that one email. The last time we got so much money was because of Tibet, which is sort of a darling issue of the left. But we got a lot of responses to that. And I think it just goes to show that I think there are more people than we expect from all different sides, whatever their religious background is, whatever their ethnic background is, whatever, who want critical discussions about what is happening. And when we sent out that email, I was so excited that, about 40,000 people responded, as in they wrote to Secretary Rice. But more importantly, I was excited about the money, because it shows that there are people, our major donors, who are eager to see us do more work like this. But again, it has to come from just taking those bold steps to end that culture of impunity. Another one is approach a member of Congress. Amnesty just wrote a letter to Congress today. It's up on the front page of our website. Again, that was one of those things where it's like, well, with so many people voting for this lopsided resolution condemning Hamas, is Congress really going to do much? I'm not naive about this. I don't think